You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
So I had a weird thing happen the other day, and I made mention before that there was a comic that I owned that was Captain Marvel, and at the end of it, these characters came and just like packed up the universe, and Captain Marvel was just standing on a blank page, like he was on a movie set that everything had been hauled off, and so what's funny is before we recorded that episode, I mentioned that I have it. But here's the funny thing about that. I found that on the shelf among my regular books, which is odd because that's not where I store my comics.
Right.
And so I thought that was kind of odd. And I pick it up and I look through it. I'm like, Captain Marvel, which edition is this? Which issue is this? And so I flip through it, I'm like, oh, it's this one. I didn't realize I'd bought this. I want to read this again, and I probably should. So I put it back on the shelf. And since the time we recorded that episode where I mentioned it and this episode, I've looked all over my shelves and I cannot find it anywhere.
Yes, skip timelines.
So I don't know. Yeah, it's like, yeah, did somebody forget to rebuild my set? Or did I jump into another timeline? It's like being an episode of Star Trek where it should be right here. It should be, I'm pretty sure it was on that particular shelf right there, but I've looked on every single one and I can't find it. So that's just bizarre.
What do they call that? There's it's like the whole Berenstein debate where, I can remember as a kid, Berenstein. I remember sounding it out. I remember being confused when people said Berenstain, and it just did not make sense. So I think there's something going on there.
Yeah, but I remember Berenstain because I hated the way it sounded, even though like that's what it said on the page.
Yeah, well, the Henry VIII painting of him holding the turkey leg that does not exist, but everybody remembers having seen.
I don't remember that one.
See, I have the image in my head so plain as day.
I think too many people have been to medieval fairs. They've seen a guy dressed as Henry VIII with a turkey leg. I think that's what that's about.
Maybe. Well, and then there's the whole Sinbad did a movie with him as a genie that actually never happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I
read that article, but I don't remember the Henry VIII. And I know I think they're confusing, was it Kazam with Shaq?
Well, see, I can see that. I can see that. That would be something I would be not familiar enough with to say one way or the other.
Okay, so here's what I think happened with that one is there was Kazam with Shaq, but then there was also The Adventures of Sinbad the Sailor, which the costuming on was like
very similar.
And I think that's what happened is those three things colliding in people's minds, like just running around in there like the Hadron Collider, messed it all up.
Well, but time is such a weird commodity. I don't know. I love all the quantum physics and mathematics, even though I couldn't do any of it to save my life. I like the principles behind it and the whole multiverse sort of idea, and that I don't know. I know a lot of Christians who are really against that because wait a minute, you can't have a multiverse because then God's not
because
God.
Then I can't be as narcissistic. I mean, because I know I'm with you. God's infinite. He can have as many universes as he wants.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just kind of a silly limit. He built this one. Can't he build another?
Right. And who are we to say they can't? And to me, it's one of those things, is it, when you look at questions like that, does the answer make God bigger or does it make him smaller? And anytime it diminishes God in my mind, then I'm going to reject it just outright.
Right. Well, but to me, it's like, I think that tells you more about what the person thinks of themselves and their own importance versus God. It's like, oh no, he can't make another universe. Well, why not? Well, because then it dismantles what I believe about this one. Well, why? You're in this one.
Well,
that's the one that matters to you.
Well, and here's the other thing, because it's kind of backwards as far as the narcissism goes, because theoretically, in these infinite number of universes that God is infinitely in charge of, there would be a number of you out there, maybe not infinite, but definitely numerous, some version of you in different ones. So you become larger within this scenario too.
No, but then you become less unique. And that's counter to the narcissistic thing.
I know.
Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, of course, are the multiple universes, are they actually parallels, or are they different dimensions where different rules of physics apply?
Yes. Yes. It's all of that. And
again, speculation. We don't know the math.
Well, and I think this is something you and I have talked about so often. We take for granted that what is what has to be. And we assume that because we live on a spherical planet.
Like the royal we.
We.
Yeah, not you and me specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Because
we've talked about this.
Because I like the thought experiment. Well, what if there is a universe out there where the Earth is on the back of a turtle?
Or what if there's a universe that the planets are conical? That wouldn't work in the physics that we have going on in this universe, but who's to say it couldn't work in a universe that doesn't operate by the same laws of physics that govern us?
Yeah.
And nothing has to be the way it is. It could be any way, because we serve an infinite God with an infinite imagination. And so why do we have to? I just don't understand when people want to limit what God can do because it makes them uncomfortable. The things that God has revealed about himself should make us uncomfortable.
Right.
So,
right.
Again, why are we making this arbitrary line?
Yeah. And it's just, and also it's a lot more fun to, just play with those ideas. It doesn't mean you have to embrace or accept them or be dogmatic about them, but at least be able to ponder them. I mean, God surely is okay with us pondering these things.
I think it just opens up a different dimension of God. It opens up a different dimension of our own being. Okay. Total speculation. I need to preface this like big time speculation. I don't know this. I'm not saying the Bible says this. I'm not saying that any of this. But, you and I, one of the thought experiments we had that we've talked about is at the Tower of Babel. What if what was confused there wasn't just the spoken word, but just communication in general?
I think it was more communication in general, because I know they often use tongues to refer to languages, and that's probably ultimately what it was. But I think there's also a lot of interpersonal communication skills that we lost at that time.
Well, so. I would even, let's take it even to the nth degree and go like telepathy. I mean, I can go there.
I know you can go there. Sure, whatever. I mean, again, why draw the line there? But, I think, is it possible? Sure. I mean, I think there's definitely, we have a God who can speak directly to our minds, or, or what have you. So why wouldn't we? But I don't know if it's, I don't know.
Well,
I don't know if I'm ready to actually go there. I mean, it would be great, but is it, would we really want to be able to read everyone else's thoughts?
Well, what got me actually thinking about this was when we worked, you and I did a reception for some friends of ours. They were getting married. That was our wedding gift. And another friend showed up, and he said it creeped him out the way that we work together.
Right.
Because you and I don't have to talk a lot of times when we're doing some kind of manual labor, a nod, a grunt, a gesture, and we know what the other one's already thinking.
Right.
So I think, what if that was going on, and maybe even a deeper level, and I think telepathy is probably the best way to describe it. You and I aren't telepathic,
Right?
but
No.
we just know each other. There's that familiarity because we grew up working together.
Mhm.
And so, that's a thought experiment. I'm not saying that's definitely what happened, but I think playing with that idea,
Yeah.
that's fun. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it actually causes us to be more imaginative about the text in general.
Right.
And
And yeah. Well, speaking of, I feel like we've gone on really long.
well,
with
this is our oddity part.
But yeah, and this can be the oddities, sure. But yeah, speaking of things not having to be the way they are, let's talk about Genesis.
Yeah, so we left off with Lot and his daughters last week, and how he abdicated his role as father and protector for his daughters.
Mhm.
And so in the end, that reverses. And reversal is a huge theme in the Bible. And now Lot, when he abdicated that role as father and protector, now he needs protection from his daughters. And I think that's just a really cool. It's horrifying, but it's also kind of cool that God allowed this to be reversed, and so the victim becomes the ones who rise up and take advantage of the situation.
I don't know if "cool's" the word you'd want to use, but interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Illustrative.
Yeah, cool makes it sound like it's something that you should want, and it's not. It's not something you want. But sea cucumbers aren't something you should want, but they're still kind of cool in a disturbing way. So,
the sea cucumber, that's an interesting choice.
Well, that's the one that pukes out its guts so that the predator can eat the guts and it can escape.
Huh.
Yeah. And evidently this is food.
Well, it's something the predator wants, but go ahead.
So we've left Lot and his daughter behind, and now we never return to Lot, really. We do hear about his descendants later on. But now we're back with Abraham and Sarah. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this chapter because we've already heard this story. This story happened already with Pharaoh.
So we're getting to Abraham and Abimelech, just kind of set it up. It's basically it's a retelling of what happened with Pharaoh in Egypt when Abraham, we talked about the second time he tries to pawn his wife off as his sister.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's basically what happens here. But again, we're going with the retelling. So let's talk about what's different here and what's important.
Right, because you can only contrast similar things to find the differences. And so you've got to have something similar to start out with. And so the main premise, like you said, very similar. But two things going on here. Just as Pharaoh is never named, Abimelech is never named in the Bible. This is actually just a title for a great and mighty king. And so he is, it tells us a little bit about his nature. Abimelech's one of those characters that never changes. Wherever he shows up, he's the same dude all the time. And he's just kind of got this entitled attitude. He's got this, look at me, I'm so righteous, I'm so great. Sounds like the heathens are home.
Yeah, the children are home.
So he takes
what that
Sarah.
Sound was.
He takes Sarah as his wife. And God comes to him in a dream and says, hey, you don't want to do this or I'm going to have to kill you. It just, that's pretty much what it boils down to.
Yeah.
It's a good paraphrase.
Essentially, yeah. Go ahead.
Well, and I think this is really interesting too, because if you compare and contrast this to when Jacob has the dream, the wording is that one, there's a distinction here, and I know we haven't got to Jacob yet. God appears to Abimelech in a dream. God imposes himself into Abimelech's dream.
Mm-hmm.
God becomes a part of the dream that Jacob was already having when you look at the wording and how it's set up in the Hebrew. So Jacob's dreams were to see God, and God revealed himself, where Abimelech, he's not looking for God.
Right.
And this is a really great testament of God's sovereignty. He doesn't have to, he didn't have to appear to Abimelech. He's not who Abimelech is necessarily worshiping,
mm-hmm.
and yet he can still show up. And so I thought this was that was a really good point that was being made.
Are you talking about God showing up in a situation where someone doesn't worship him specifically? And I think we mentioned like the Dagon thing with Jonah. God showed up and used the fish to talk to the people who were not worshiping him. They were worshiping the fish, and he decided to show up. You see that. And it makes sense.
Yeah. So when Abimelech has this dream, the other thing that happens, we talked a little bit last week about how we're starting to get a hint that Abraham is a prophet. Mm-hmm. And here's the first time that we have the word prophet appear in the text. And it's spoken to Abimelech on behalf of Sarah. So the first time the role of prophet is identified, it's in the service of protecting a woman. And I think that's very interesting. And the word in Hebrew is navi. And it comes from the Akkadian navu, and it means called one. Okay. And so our idea of prophet so often have gotten mixed up with the idea that to be a prophet, it's someone who can see into the future and who can foretell things getting ready to happen.
It kind of gets conflated with soothsayer.
Well, it does, because what the word it means called one. And in the Latin, that got picked up as vocativa or vocativo, which is where we get our word vocation.
Okay.
So it's not just the idea of someone called to tell the future. It's just anyone who has a specific calling. Mm-hmm. And now, obviously, being God's prophet encompasses more than that. But when they went back and translated the Bible from the Hebrew to the Greek, trying to figure out what word to use was very difficult. Mm-hmm. Because in Greek mythology, probably the most familiar to people was the oracle at Delphi. Mm-hmm. Delphi. We see that in kind of represented in 300, where you've got the woman who's receiving the messages. She's actually the conduit that comes in contact with the gods and is able to give the information. But then, as she is a mantis, she is not a prophetess. She is a mantis, because she goes into an altered state. She is able to receive these words. And then the prophet is the one who takes her words and translates them so that the kings can, and those coming to the temple can actually understand what's being said.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So is that where we get the term mantra from? Does that have anything
I
to do
would
with it?
I would have to go back and research that, because now we're getting into more of the Sanskrit.
Linguistics.
And I didn't do that side of things. I studied a lot of this with my thesis about the prophets. And so the prophet is the one who speaks.
And that was a question, not a statement, by the way. I don't want to think that I'm like throwing that out there. So
yeah, and that would be interesting to research. But yeah, the prophet is one who speaks on behalf of the other. And so that's basically what it means. So God's prophets speak on behalf of him. They don't have to go into an altered state. They don't have to take leave of their senses in order to speak.
Right. Okay. And, makes sense.
Well, yeah, because madness and being a prophet were often conflated. Even King David, when he was hiding among the Philistines, when he realized, oh, wait a minute, they might kill me, he pretends to be mad, and they won't touch him because he might be a prophet.
Okay, yeah.
And so you get some really fun dynamics going on. Another one in Exodus, we talked about this before, Exodus 7, when God tells Moses, I'm going to make you like a god, and Aaron's going to be your prophet. Aaron's going to speak on behalf of Moses because Moses is claiming to stutter. So therefore, he needs someone to be his voice.
Gotcha.
So this is the first time we see this come up. And it's interesting to me that it's in use with a foreign person. It's in use for the service of a woman, for the protection of a woman. Mm-hmm. And so this is pretty significant, because there's this law of first mention in translation that basically says the first time something comes up is going to kind of define its usage, and it's going to kind of show you the importance and significance of that. So this is the first time it comes up. The second thing that I think needs to be pointed out is when Abraham's confronted, Abraham goes straight up used car salesman on Abimelech. I mean, he just gets all sorts of, well, I was scared you were going to kill me, and it's not really a lie. She is my sister, and we do this everywhere. And there's like all this justification and all of this rationale about why it was okay for him to lie.
Right.
And the thing is, if you look at the words in the Hebrew, I don't think it comes out in the English so much. If you look at it in the Hebrew, the verbs are the same. The words that Abraham uses and the words that Abimelech uses to God, they're the same words. It's the same verbs, kind of. They're talking the same language here.
Okay.
And so you've kind of got this conflation between Abimelech and Abraham kind of having these same characteristics, which really isn't too much of a stretch because Abraham is not, he's been called out of this culture. He's been called out of this foreign land. So he's in the process of converting and in the process of becoming who God wants him to be. He's not there yet.
Right.
So I think that's kind of one of those things that we overlook and we miss, this kind of Abraham and Abimelech kind of click.
Right.
And matter of fact, Abimelech asked Abraham to stay. And this is going to be important because Isaac's going to have an interaction with Abimelech later. Mm-hmm. And so Abimelech and Abraham, they make this treaty. Abraham stays there with him for a while, and everything seems to go well because they speak the same language.
Right.
There's
helpful.
Yeah, there's no real distinction between the two. So, and one of the things in Abraham's speech to Abimelech, and this is kind of telling, that he says in verse 13, God made me wander from my father's house. And the wording there is wandering, aimlessly lost. I'm hopeless. There's despair, and God made it, and there's this implication that God made all these great promises, but he's not following through on them. And Abimelech's kind of like, oh, dude, I got you. You just stay here. We'll take care of you. And so there forms this kind of bond that shows that Abraham still hasn't managed to separate himself fully from the people he was called to leave behind. And before we leave this story, we should notice what's not in the text, because what's not said is often as important as what is said.
No, is this where we're going to compare the Pharaoh and Abimelech?
Yeah, because there's one main distinction, and there's just one, really. The Bible specifically says that Abimelech had not touched Sarah.
Right. Well, there's that, and isn't this where Abraham says, no, I'm not going to take your stuff? That was
with the 4 kings.
That was, okay, that's right. That was before. I was looking for it here, and I was thinking, yeah. So, yeah, he specifically says, yeah, because that was what was not in the recount with Pharaoh, is that.
Yeah, Pharaoh gives him stuff. Now, Abraham does receive something from Abimelech, actually. He gives Abraham, let's see how much silver, 1,000 pieces of silver, 1,000 pieces of silver. And this was customary. This was not part of the Jewish law. This was actually part of the law of the land, that if a man took another man's wife accidentally or whatever, mm-hmm. I don't know how you can accidentally take a wife, but evidently it happened enough they had a system in place.
What do you think happens in Vegas all the time?
It stays in Vegas.
It stays there. So, but yeah, I've never done it. I've accidentally taken a wife.
But that's
I was very specific about my wife choosing.
Yeah, hey, she looks good. I'll take her home. And so, yeah, they had a system in place that basically, if you took another man's wife accidentally and then you find out and you're going to return her, then you have to pay that husband money as kind of a testament to say, hey, I didn't touch her. And the fact that you paid the money was it told the community she's fine.
I didn't realize that. That's
yeah. And this we have other archaeological proof and data that shows that this is not just with Abraham and Sarah. This actually went on.
Yeah, it's funny to me the way when you're going to return her, I'm like, did you be sure to take a receipt? Sorry, that was terrible.
Well,
but
It's weird.
Just the way you phrase it. I'm not for spouse purchasing. Seems like a bad idea.
Yeah. I think it's illegal in this day and age. But laws of the land you're in.
And it's also a bad idea. So go ahead.
Very, very bad idea. But Abimelech's wording is actually very telling here, because one of the things he says is, I herewith give your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. And so even as he's returning her, he's still saying, well, yeah, you're a sister. You're not really his wife. And Abraham still isn't thinking of Sarah as his wife.
Right.
She's his sister. And
now, is it that, or is he being like a jerk about it? Yeah. Yeah. Here's for some money for your brother. Like,
this is where, if women had written this, we would know so much more information.
Exactly the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Here's some money. Be sure to take it to your brother. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's because that's how I read it. I really read it as, when I first went through, that was kind of snarky. This your brother, give him the money. Yeah. But one of the teachers I was listening to, he's like, no, this really tells you where Abimelech and Abraham are talking this shared language before, and then to have this follow up, that Abimelech, he knows what's going on. Right. He's got a good read on the situation because he identifies himself in the situation. He could be Abraham.
Sure.
And I think actually this is a good place to answer a question that one of the people in the paddle store asked us about Abraham and Sarah being brother and sister. And by the way, the paddle store, shameless plug, if you're a supporter on Patreon, you get to be a member of the paddle store. And this is where we discuss all the stuff, and you can suggest show topics and ask your questions. So one of the members in the paddle store asked us, why was this allowable? Why was this something that occurred?
Yeah. Well, and they did that in light of the is it Levitical or Deuteronomy, but it's where it talks about who you're allowed to pair up with. You're not supposed to uncover the nakedness of your sister and brother and
your aunt, and a very specific list.
Aunt, your uncle, your mama, your granny. Sorry, that's
very, very specific list in Leviticus. And of course, we know that Leviticus was written later. Mm-hmm. But the problem is we have some very good clues that there is an awareness of at least some of the Levitical law. And even look at Abimelech when he responds to God. He says, and God said to him in the dream, I know that you did. Okay, wait a minute. Let me back up. This is verse 4, chapter 20, verse 4. Now Abimelech had not approached her. And he says, oh Lord, will you slay me even though innocent? He said, he himself said to me, she is my sister. And she also said, he is my brother. When I did this, my heart was blameless. My hands are clean. Mm-hmm. And then God says to him, I know that you did this with blameless heart. And so I kept you from sinning against me. And that's why I did not let you touch her. And so there's some understanding there is a moral code.
Right.
And even if you read a lot of the Midrash and the ancient stories, it's interesting because they'll have like people davening and saying certain prayers that hadn't been written yet.
Right.
And so this presents a problem, because why is Abraham married to his sister? Now, she's his half-sister. They had the same father and a different mother, which would not have been that uncommon because polygamy, obviously it's a thing at this point.
Right. And early death and childbirth, multiple marriages and things like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, we got to remember Abraham was not a Christian he was never a Christian. Okay, well, I misspoke there. Yeah, Abraham was never a Christian, but he wasn't even a Jew at this point.
Right.
He's the father of the Jewish nations, but he's got to go through this process in order to get there. And so when he married Sarah, it was before God had even revealed himself. So how would he know what was right and wrong? How could he begin to anticipate that this is what God was going to have him do, or what he was going to demand of people? So I think we need to be understanding, even today when we look at believers, are they living up to the what are they having to do to honor the commitments and do the right thing based on the decisions they made before, in light of what they know as new believers?
Right.
Because I think we've both known couples who maybe got married before they were Christians, and then
converted. Yeah,
one of them converted, the other one didn't.
You stay together.
Yeah. And because two wrongs don't make a right, and so to divorce Sarah at this point, specifically when God has included her in the covenant promise, we that would just be horrible. And so I think that's kind of what it comes down to, and a realization that people make mistakes, and in ignorance we can violate God's word, and then we have an obligation to live according to the word as we learn it. Well,
and that whole idea is encapsulated in the whole story, where the king says, or what's this? Abimelech. Sorry, lost his name for a second. Where Abimelech is like, no, I was not sinning against you when I acted that way. And God's saying, well, we're going to stop you, but now you know, and you have not done anything binding. So we're going to stop you from putting yourself in a bad situation, or a worse situation, rather.
Right. I would hate to have to knock you off. So you've got that going on. And I think the other reason too, and this is actually not me, this is something that was pointed out by many Jewish scholars long before I was born. The inclusion that Abimelech had not touched her is important, because the very next story is when she has Isaac.
Right.
And so there can't be any confusion.
Right. Yeah, as to who was the father. Yeah.
So this really does protect Isaac's identity as a child of the covenant. And that's going to be so significant as we move forward, because we're getting ready to go into Isaac's birth, the expulsion of Ishmael, and the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. So you've got these three stories that are going to build on who has which identity. Who's Ishmael in the scheme of thing, and who is Isaac in the scheme of thing, and how does Abraham view Sarah and Hagar, Isaac and Ishmael, and how does that affect his progress in stepping into his role in the kingdom?
Right.
So, do we want to jump into that part, or?
Well, do we have anything else to cover beforehand? Because we're a little short on time, but we can get started with it and kind of set the stage.
Okay. What we can cover. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of these passages that we're getting ready to go into, and maybe we won't go into the passages just yet. Maybe we'll save that for next week. But these passages, I did not realize they're read on Rosh Hashanah.
Okay.
Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year. And it happens somewhere because the Jewish year is based on lunar cycles, and lunar cycles are not as regular as solar cycles. So
there is regular, but they don't sync up annually to the position of the Earth. Where it is with the sun. It's not in sync with the Earth's orbit of the sun.
Right. So the dates move around, and there's like a whole complicated mathematical system.
Yeah, and the seasons move. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. They have to do this whole thing to make sure that like Passover is in the spring and that the New Year is in the fall, which the New Year is in the fall. It's when there's harvest. And the reason for this is, there's part of it's laid out in Exodus and how to keep the dates, but also part of it goes back to when Adam and Eve were in the garden, the first day of creation. They stepped into a garden that was full of fruit. And so it was already ready to sustain life.
Okay, that makes sense. I do think it's funny, though, and this is kind of an aside, that now we're using the Roman calendar, basically. That so many other cultures celebrated the New Year in the fall, and in Rome, it's in the winter.
Yeah, and I don't know why that is. Do you?
I know that a lot of it, at least in the Roman pagan cultures, Roman culture, pagan culture, Celtic and all that other stuff. A lot of that, had to do with the death of what they called the death of the sun, where it was, your days were getting shorter and things like that. But I don't know why the Roman culture would be farther in. The only guess I have, and we can do research. If anyone knows, tell us. We're open to more information,
please.
Yeah, but I think it has to do with the solstice in the Roman calendar. There's the shortest day of the year, and so now your days are getting longer. And I don't know why so many other cultures have it in the fall, like the Jewish culture and a lot of the Celtic cultures had it. Where Halloween would be, or Samhain, which is spelled Samhain, because it's Gaelic and not English. And Gaelic, like French, they don't like to pronounce all the letters in a word.
Just throw a few extra ones in there for good measure.
Yeah, it's R, a Q, a P, and a Z. But I don't know why why your new year would start with the days still getting shorter.
Yeah, that's
the Roman calendar. I guess that's the difference between our minds and the ancient mind.
I would have to do some major research. And
now the thing with that, the Jewish reasoning with Adam and Eve, that's when creation was finished, in a garden full of fruit for your first year. Yeah, that would make sense, but I don't know in the other cultures. So
yeah, the thing is, this date really does. We aren't going to go into it fully. You'll just have to take my word for it, or reference Dr. Heiser's teaching on the date of Jesus' birth and the importance of the new year. And so this is
and we'll link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, we should, because it's really interesting. But typically, New Year's is sometime around September.
Usually early September.
And so you've got September, and up until the 800s, it was only a one-day event. It was only celebrated 800 CE, 800 AD, whichever one you want to use there. It was only a one-day event, and on Jewish holidays, a lot of Christians don't realize there's a set reading. There's set passages that you read through. There's set passages that you pray through. And so you've got to know what they are, and this continuity that's just gone back. I mean, it's amazing to me that we know 800 years ago on the first day of the year, every Jew in the world was praying this prayer.
Yeah, and that's actually a lot of our more liturgical churches are just kind of a continuation of that kind of tradition. And that's actually, we had one of our friends converted to Catholicism, and she said one of the things that she liked about it was that knowing every believer was learning about the same story that same morning whenever you go to Mass. And I do think that's kind of cool in its own way. I will say it's one of those things that it's kind of cool if you go approach it with the right attitude. I did have, so it was so funny. It reminds me, because there is a counter to this. There was, it was mid 2000s, maybe, I guess maybe 01, 02 back in the day. And I was playing at this church, and we had a guest worship leader come in who was like the music professor at one of the colleges here in Oklahoma. And like they opened the service, and he's like, "Stand with us together as we sing the currently most popular worship song in the whole world." and I'm like, well, that's a silly reason to sing a song. And we sang "Lord, I Lift Your Name on High," which at that point was probably like already 10 years old.
Something like that.
And, there's good parts to that song, but the fact that it was like, by that point it was already old and everyone was kind of tired of it. And I think that, I mean, we can also talk about the staying power of worship songs if we really want to get in that topic. But I do think, when you're like, oh, the number one worship song in the world right now, let's sing that. Oh, well, that's not a good reason to sing it.
Right. Popularity, it does not define how we practice our religion.
Yeah, but when you look at like the liturgical calendar and how we want to do things in a unified way as a church, and you have it in that perspective, it really brings in a deeper meaning to what you're doing.
Well, and there's even, I would say, another example that's even, it happens a lot and people don't realize it, is when pastors all go to the same website and get the same sermon. And now I've got no problem with pastors using tools. Don't get me wrong. It's hard teaching. But using the tools and the resources that are out there, that's fine. But don't pass them off as your own.
Right.
That's
right.
That's I've seen that happen in more than one church. And matter of fact, one church that will remain nameless, when I pointed out that I realized this was what was going on, I had a pastor who got really mad because I shouldn't know that was basically how it came across. And I'm like, but I have a brain.
Right.
I mean,
no, it is really funny because I did work last year. I worked for 4 or 5, maybe 6 months for a company that did that wrote sermon outlines for pastors. And I just keep waiting for the day that I go and I'm like, hey, I wrote this sermon. Now it was a pretty skeleton outline, so that you'd have to put in your own filler. But it was a really fun job. But I keep waiting for the day whenever I come across that. I'm just like, I think that'd be kind of cool.
Well, see, and I think a good pastor could take something like that and spend some time praying over it and working with it to bring something unique and special, so that maybe you wouldn't even realize. If he did it, I think if he did it right, you would not even realize it was your sermon.
Oh yeah, a good pastor, and now I think the giveaway would be if you worked actually in the if you were to work for this, because it was a full like package presentation. You'd get graphics and pre-made slides that you could put the outline on, and you could adjust the outline. It was really in depth. But I think if you worked in the graphics department, you'd be more likely to be like, oh, hey, that's
well, and it's probably actually a safer way for a lot of churches to go, because guys, come on, copyright infringement's not cool. It's just not.
Yeah.
And I'm using it for Jesus. Not a good excuse. Okay.
Right. Well, and they're actually there's been a lot more crackdown on stuff like that over the last years. But there are churches are getting, at least in the bigger churches, they're getting a lot more savvy about going, okay, what legally are we required to do in order to use this image? And a lot of them are paying their dues and royalties on images and songs. So that's good news.
Yeah, that's a good witness. And that's in keeping with what the Bible would require of us. And, I don't know. I could get lost on that, because I think sometimes we as Christians forget that the ends do not justify the means. And that is actually a lack of faith. And like with Abraham, passing off his wife as his sister, that ultimately is a lack of faith. Yeah, he could have died because somebody wanted to kill him for his wife, but if God had promised to make him a father of a great nation, and Sarah was the one that child was going to come through, then he needed to trust that God would fulfill his promises and stop trying to manipulate situations where he could be safe. We just spoke earlier about a situation where you said, hey, if I lose my job over this, God's going to have to step up and take care of me.
Yeah.
Because, and sometimes it is that simple. It really is. So,
well, what we were talking about was when we were talking about, last subjects. Not like I'm not doing anything shady.
Yeah.
We were just talking about the last episode and talking about, Sodom and Gomorrah and all that. So I was making a joke.
Yes, it was.
I'm not actually in danger that I know of. I don't think that would happen.
Yeah, I know you aren't there, and I think that the thing is, I think there's got to be a little bit of that attitude, though, in what we do as Christians, that if I make somebody mad or I offend somebody for, and I'm not talking about deliberately being offensive. I'm talking about if you are truly living your faith and something you do offend somebody, then you still need to be graceful and handle it in a polite way. But
yeah, but there are people in the world who will take the fact that what they're doing is offensive as their litmus test for, oh, well, the gospel's offensive, so what I'm doing must be the gospel if it's offensive. No, it doesn't work that way.
Hitler was offensive. So, if we're going to go down that road.
Oh, man. Yeah. Let's not even, let's not do the Hitler argument. That's ridiculous. So anyway.
But it makes a point.
So Rosh Hashanah. Yeah.
So up until the 800s, this was like a one-day event. And the thing is, in modern times, a lot of the emphasis is put on the second day's reading. And the second day's reading is the binding of Isaac. And I think we're kind of all familiar with that. And as we get ready to move into the expulsion of Ishmael and the binding of Isaac, which is Genesis 21 and 22, I would encourage anyone to take some time and actually read through that before
next week. Yeah,
just so you're familiar. But today we kind of think of that. It's thought that the binding of Isaac is the cornerstone text for that holiday. Mm-hmm. But when it was just a one-day celebration, the cornerstone text was the expulsion of Ishmael. It was not the binding of Isaac. And so I think the binding of Isaac kind of gets overlooked. Not binding. The expulsion of Ishmael gets overlooked even in Christian circles today, that we don't see that as an important story. And it's because nobody looks good in that story.
Right. Yeah.
Everyone winds up being disappointing in some form or fashion. So I think by taking some time and actually looking at it and seeing why it's necessary to be familiar with that story before we get to the binding of Isaac, which is, binding of Isaac's like one of the top 3 stories in Genesis. Mm-hmm. And so to get there is, that's going to be important. It's going to help us understand and get more out of the binding of Isaac that we wouldn't see otherwise. So we've kind of rambled around everywhere today, but I don't know. I think this is probably a good place to say.
So that kind of gives you some of the importance of it, and we'll get more into it, and you'll kind of see that as we get through the text. But anyway, that's probably a good place to wrap up for this week. But we just want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in. If you like what you heard, subscribe, share, write us a review. Mm-hmm. Those things help us out. If you really like us, hit us up on Patreon. Everywhere you can find us on social media, all across the board, Raven Creek SC, ravencreeksc.com. Questions, comments, anything like that, we want to hear from you. And
complaints into him.
No, other way. So anyway, no, we enjoy having you. We enjoyed the conversation. And again, thank you as always for tuning in, and we will see you next week. Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.